After having determined the timeline placement of Pokémon Legends EA in my previous videos, it is time for me to look back and answer the following question. When does Pokémon Legends Arceus really take place in? At first glance, you might think that the game takes place in feudal Japan, aka the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868. However, as you may know, this was the time period in which Japan closed itself off. And in the game, we see people coming from Alola and Galar, which are based on Hawaii and England respectively, which shouldn't be possible if it really was set in the Edo period, so it can't be that. Now, general consensus states that the game takes place in the Meiji era, which lasted from 1868 to 1912. And considering the way how buildings look, it seems perfectly logical for this to be the case. Surely there's no way that this could ever not be the case, right? Right? This is where we hit the major problem with this theory. Pokeballs. You see, Pokeballs were invented in 1925. Specifically, they were invented in Southern University in Kanto by Professor Westwood. And we know this because of red and blue additional content, which puts us well outside the Meiji era. Actually, that puts us near the end of the Taisho era, which lasted from 1912 to 1926. And when considering the fact that Pokeballs were implied to be present at least 2 years prior to the events of the game, it puts us in 1927 at the absolute earliest, which is just outside the Taisho era. And that puts us right at the start of the Showa era, which lasted from 1926 to 1989. However, that was just the beginning, as we began to see more and more modern technology being implied to be used, shifting the setting date more and more towards later dates. Like when you black out, for example. When you black out in this game, you don't lose any money, unlike in other games where you do lose some of your money when you black out. Implying that, unlike in other games where you carry hard cash, which is to say coins and bills with you, you have a credit card with you in this game. And credit cards were only invented in 1950 and didn't become widespread until the 1980s, placing us right at the start of the Japanese post-war economic miracle. And we're still far from done. Picture this. You're at a photography studio in Jubilee Village to take pictures of your Pokémon. And the pictures they gave you of your Pokémon are in color 720p 16:9 aspect ratio. While color cameras were invented in 1903, they only became widespread in the 1960s. Meanwhile, color HD, aka 720p cameras weren't invented until 1979 and didn't become widespread until the 2010s. Not to mention the fact that the 16:9 aspect ratio was only invented in 1984 and didn't become widespread until the 2000s. This puts us near the end of the Showa era. And we're still not done yet. From anywhere at any time, you can send lost satchels back to their original owners. However, that requires the existence of commercial drones, which weren't invented until 2006 and didn't become widespread until the 2020s to have the satchels be transported from even the most remote of all places. And even then, it requires the existence of GPS, which was first established in 1978 and wasn't fully functional until 1993, to have the drones know where you are so that they could send the satchels from you to the original owners. By the way, this is also the reason why you can see where you are by using your ARC phone, more on that in just a moment. But even then, it still requires the internet, which wasn't invented until 1991 and only became widespread in the 2000s to have the drones even know that you have a lost satchel to return in the first place. And even then, it requires said internet to be compatible with your ARC phone, which is basically a smartphone, which itself was only invented in 2007 and only became widespread in the 2010s. And with that, we've now left the Showa era entirely. We're now in the Heisei era, which lasted from 1989 to 2019. We could go on and talk about the implied existence of even more modern technology, but it all leads to the same conclusion. Pushing us futureward into the Reiwa era, which lasted from 2019 and is still ongoing, and beyond. Suggesting that Legends Arceus may not actually take place in the past after all, instead taking place in the post-apocalyptic future. And we would have certainly confirmed that if it weren't for space-time distortions to trip us up. You see, space-time distortions bring Pokémon and items from the present to whatever time period Legends Arceus takes place in. And among these items, there could very well be modern technology that are used in Hisui. This means that we don't actually know if Legends Arceus takes place in the past or the post-apocalyptic future. Wait a minute, that sounds a lot like time travel. And indeed, space-time distortions are a form of time travel. If only we could find out how time travel works exactly in Pokémon so that we could narrow down the time frame of Legends Arceus back down. And while both Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Scarlet and Violet also explore time travel, unfortunately, neither of them actually show us how time travel works exactly in Pokémon, as Heart Gold and Soul Silver leaves it unclear on that front, and Scarlet and Violet later reveals that it wasn't actually time travel at all. So we're sadly unable to find out how time travel in Pokémon works exactly. Or is it? In Diamond and Pearl, there exists a book known as Sinnoh Folk Story 3 located in Canalave Library in Canalave City. And Sinnoh Folk Story 3 states that humans and Pokémon were once indistinguishable from one another. The Japanese translation even explicitly states that humans and Pokémon were once the same. Can you guess what Sinnoh Folk Story 3 is referring to? That's right, the Mystery Dungeon games. And in the Mystery Dungeon games, there are humans and Pokémon, which were originally humans, that look indistinguishable from regular Pokémon as stated in Sinnoh Folk Story 3. And these humans and Pokémon live close to and ate at the same table as regular Pokémon as stated in Sinnoh Folk Story 3. And although we don't see them actually marry as stated in the Japanese translation, and in fact we don't see any marriages whatsoever in the Mystery Dungeon games, we do see them bond relationships so good that when one dies or otherwise disappears, the other always mourns as if they were in an actual marriage. Not only implying that the Mystery Dungeon games are canon to mainline games, but also that the Mystery Dungeon games take place in the distant past, long before humans even existed in the Pokémon world. And among these, there's one in particular that we're especially looking into: Explorers. In Explorers, the hero is from the bad future, and near the end of the game, the hero, along with the partner, battles and eventually defeats Primal Dialga. However, in doing so, the bad future got erased from existence, being replaced by the fixed future, thus creating a grandfather paradox, resulting in the hero slowly disappearing from existence and the partner mourning. And with that, we finally know how time travel works exactly in Pokémon. Which brings us back to Legends Arceus, where near the end of the game, Ray or Kari battles and eventually defeats Valo atop Mount Coronet, preventing Valo's plan of recreating the universe in his image from being realized, and in the process, removing the bad future and replacing it with the fixed future. We also need to remember that Ray or Kari is implied to be from the present day, or in other words, the early 21st century. So what happens next ultimately determines the timeline placement of Legends Arceus. If the game did take place in the past, then Ray or Kari would be from the bad future, and would therefore, after defeating Valo, slowly disappear due to a grandfather paradox. In reality, however, what actually happens is that no grandfather paradox happened, and Ray or Kari doesn't disappear after defeating Valo, instead continuing to exist as normal. And this implies that Ray or Kari can't be from the bad future, and therefore Legends Arceus can't actually take place in the past at all. Instead, Ray or Kari has to be from the past, and therefore, Legends Arceus must take place in the post-apocalyptic future as the implied existence of modern technology suggests. And there we have it. Legends Arceus takes place in the post-apocalyptic future. But to figure out when exactly in the post-apocalyptic future does it take place in, we need to go even further. Vesa states that hundreds of years ago, Spiritomb got sealed. Additionally, we know from Diamond and Pearl that Spiritomb got sealed 500 years prior to the events of Diamond and Pearl. And since it is implied that Diamond and Pearl takes place in 1999, it means that Spiritomb got sealed in 1499. Which means that Vesa's statement implies that Legends Arceus takes place no later than 2498. Because if it took place in 2499, then Vesa would have said 1,000 years ago instead. And likewise, if it took place in 2500 or later, then Vesa would have said over 1,000 years ago instead. But with the maximum date being found at 2498, finding the minimum date is even harder. Now, with Legends Arceus taking place in a post-apocalyptic future, it also implicates an apocalypse that happens sometime before the events of Legends Arceus. And we also know that civilization needs to take around 50 years in order to start rebuilding itself after an apocalypse, as shown with Jubilife Village being built on top of the ruins of Jubilife City 2 years prior to the events of Legends Arceus, meaning that Legends Arceus takes place at least 50 years after the apocalypse. And when considering that Scarlet and Violet is implied to take place in 2022, with Legends EA likely taking place in 2025, the apocalypse could very well happen in 2026, allowing Legends Arceus to take place as early as 2076. However, 2026 is also the likely suspected date that Gen 10, whatever it's actually going to be called, will take place in. And it is suspected that the actual date of the apocalypse is much later, like 2077. So to take this into account, let's just say that Legends Arceus takes place in 2100 at the earliest, with the apocalypse happening no earlier than 2050. And that's our final answer. Pokémon Legends Arceus takes place anywhere from 2100 to 2498. However, if I had to guess the exact year Legends Arceus would take place in, it would be 2222, as it's exactly 200 years after the release of the game in the human world. It is also a Schnapszahl, which is a number that only contains a single unique digit. Either way, if you'd like to see me cover a specific topic, make sure to drop a comment so that I could see it and start working on it.